Kyiv has vowed that it will not surrender to Moscow. The foreign ministers of Ukraine and Russia have held a round of tense talks in Turkey. It was the highest level negotiations so far, but there's been no progress on a ceasefire. Sergei Lavrov and Dmytro Kuleba were locked in talks for over an hour. Ukraine insists the war cannot be stopped if the country who started the aggression has no desire to do so. Russia blames the conflict on the West, forcing Ukraine to choose sides between Russia and them. Both have agreed to continue efforts to find a solution to humanitarian issues. We go live to Western Ukraine and Lviv in a moment, but first a look at the ongoing devastating damage on the ground as Russia's invasion enters a third week.
Multiple airstrikes pounded the besieged city of Mariupol. This maternity and children's hospital was completely destroyed by relentless shelling. Several patients were buried under the rubble. Police and soldiers rushed to the scene to evacuate victims, including several heavily pregnant women. Officials say at least 3 people, including 1 child, have been killed. 17 others were injured. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia's bombing of the hospital is a war crime. But Moscow claims this is fake news. It insists the hospital had been long taken over by Ukrainian troops and that firing positions had been set up there. Mr. Zelensky again called for a no-fly zone to be imposed.
Ми маємо разом повернути деяким лідерам Заходу сміливість, щоб вони нарешті зробили те, що повинні були зробити ще у перший день вторгнення. Або закрити українське небо від російських ракет і бомб, або дати нам бойові літаки, щоб ми все зробили самі. Пауза без рішення стала вже просто вбивчою.
Civilians continue to flee some of Ukraine's hardest hit cities. More than 35,000 people were evacuated through humanitarian corridors yesterday. Authorities have said 6 escape routes would allow more to leave as Moscow and Kyiv agree to more ceasefires across the country. Reports say Russia's military column northwest of Kyiv has made little progress in over a week and that it was suffering losses. It's estimated that 5,000 to 6,000 Russian troops have died in Ukraine. British intelligence say Moscow has had to deploy conscript troops despite President Vladimir Putin's earlier assurance that that wouldn't happen. Washington has warned Russia is growing increasingly desperate and could resort to chemical weapons attacks against civilians.
Philip Crowther joins us live from Lviv in Ukraine. Philip, those talks between the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine have failed to find any common ground. Where does this leave diplomatic efforts now?
Well, there are high-level talks over in Antalya, like the ones we saw between the 2 foreign ministers, and then there are other smaller avenues that can be found on the ground. There is still hope that today there could be up to 7 ceasefires holding around cities that are currently being besieged by Russian forces, 7 humanitarian corridors or safe passage corridors also to get civilians out of those areas and possibly also to get humanitarian aid in. Out of those 7 that might work out today, only 3 did yesterday, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, those are very local ceasefires. As for a general ceasefire, it's very simple. No chance of that happening right now, based on the talks between Kuleba and Lavrov in Turkey earlier today. Now, the Russian foreign minister did say that he would be ready for more negotiations, but at the same time, he said things like this: "We didn't attack Ukraine." This coming from the foreign minister representing a country with what are believed to be 100,000 troops currently inside Ukraine. Lavrov also saying this, that the United States is preparing biological weapons in secret locations. He said this without offering any proof.
Today's talks took place as Ukraine was hit by multiple airstrikes, including the one in Mariupol. How are these incidents and airstrikes affecting the mood and the chances for negotiations moving forward?
Well, look, the attitude from the Ukrainian government, from the Ukrainian armed forces and from the Ukrainian people is the same. And Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister of Ukraine, summarized it in very, very short words. He said there will be no surrender. This is not what they are going to get. And that atmosphere of defiance, but also of motivation, of confidence as well, of solidarity that we are seeing in this country, but that we're also seeing from the government, from the armed forces, is something that will be very, very difficult to impact in any way by Russia. There will be continued bombings and there will be continued shelling of Ukrainian cities. But right now, the Ukrainian armed forces believe that they have overcome a lot of obstacles to keep the Russian advances to a minimum. While they are still happening, it must be said, Russian forces are advancing from the south northwards, and they are advancing around two axes on both sides of the Dnipro River that lead southwards toward the capital city, Kyiv. Those are very slow advances, but they are happening. But the capital city itself is preparing for a potential battle in the streets itself, and that is a city that is going to defend itself until the very end.
Philip Crowther in Lviv, Ukraine. Thank you.
Well, Ukrainian journalist Andriy Derela joins us live now from just outside Ternopil, that's in western Ukraine. Andriy, the devastation in Mariupol, update us on the situation now and the fallout from the bombing of that maternity and children's hospital.
As the situation on the ground in Mariupol remains absolutely desperate already. It's been besieged, it's been blocked for more than a week now. And the newest report also say that unfortunately 3 people died during the bombing of the maternity ward and the maternity hospital. So, of course, Ukraine is now saying that this bombing was a war crime, that it was an absolute atrocity. However, the Russian side says that it is sure that the hospital was actually taken over by Ukrainian military troops. And as far as I have heard in the reports today, Russian Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Lavrov was even shown evidence that this was not the case and that indeed these bombs damaged the real hospital with real pregnant women, women who just gave birth and newborn children being there. But there was no reaction on that from the foreign minister of Russia.
Andriy, Ukraine's foreign minister Dmytro Kuleba says that Russia didn't agree to a humanitarian corridor in Mariupol. Evacuation attempts so far from there have failed. Are there any other ways, perhaps, to relieve the people who are trapped in that city?
The situation with the corridors is very fraught, and it's also very fluid. It changes a lot. So today in the morning, the Ukrainian vice minister, she said that there will be corridors, new corridors in multiple Ukrainian cities, including Mariupol and Volnovakha. And that was the hope that we had in the morning. However, later in the day, I heard reports that the corridor, the route through which the corridor was supposed to be going, was shelled again by the Russian army. And at the same time, Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign affairs minister of Ukraine, said that indeed there was no agreement with the Russian side on the ceasefire with the corridors, but also there was no agreement on a wider, country-wide ceasefire that the Ukrainian side has proposed to try to solve the civilian issues. Unfortunately, according to both Ukrainian authorities and the Red Cross, there is very little that could be done to relieve people in Mariupol without those corridors. And if the civilians cannot be evacuated, then at least there should be a corridor that would allow more humanitarian convoys to enter the city and bring things that people desperately need. But so far, there has been no progress on that either, as far as I understand. And all we can do everywhere is to just watch and hope that some agreement will be achieved soon.
Andriy, thank you for that update and continue to stay safe. Andriy Derela there speaking to us from Ternopil in western Ukraine.